All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going really deep on something that honestly is kind of impacting everything. I mean, we're talking global headlines, sure, but also think about like what you're going to buy for your next phone or computer. Even how countries are dealing with each other. It's all tied to this trade situation going on between the USA, China, and Europe.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? We're not talking like just abstract economics here. This is real world stuff, trade routes shifting, these crazy complicated supply chains getting all tangled up, and yeah, even that balance of power on the global stage, right?
Totally. And we've got a really interesting set of sources here to help us unpack it all. I mean, this is complicated stuff. So what we're going to do is pull out the most important insights, figure out where these trade tensions really came from, and then try and see like what could happen down the road. What are the long-term consequences?
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, really understanding the ripple effects.
Okay, so someone's just tuning in, they hear trade war, right?
Yeah.
What does that even mean? Like, break that down for us. What are we actually talking about here?
So a trade war, I think of it like countries using trade to kind of fight each other. Instead of armies, it's tariffs, like taxes on stuff coming in from other countries.
Right.
Or quotas, like saying, okay, you can only send us this much of this thing, but it's not for like normal economic reasons.
Yeah.
It's more about protecting your own industries or trying to gain some kind of advantage over another country.
Some pressure tactics, basically.
Yeah, putting the squeeze on.
And in this whole thing, who are like the main players? Who's on the field here?
Well, it's the big three, right? USA, China, and Europe. And the thing is, they're also interconnected. I mean, their economies are so tied together.
Right, right.
So, like, what one does affects the others, and the tensions between them. Those have a ripple effect, too. It's not just contained. It goes global.
Got it. So, rewind a bit. When did all this really start heating up? Like, what was the initial spark?
Well, most folks point to 2018. That's when the USA, under President Trump, started slapping these big tariffs on a bunch of stuff coming from China.
Yep, yeah.
And their reasoning was, well, they said China was doing some shady stuff, like stealing intellectual property, basically ripping off ideas and designs. And they said China was forcing companies to hand over their technology if they wanted to do business there, which is...
Yeah, pretty aggressive.
Yeah, kind of a forced trade secret situation.
Right, right. So China's not just going to take that line down, right?
No, not at all. They hit back pretty quick with their own tariffs on American goods. And that's classic trade war, right? One side does something, the other retaliates, and it just escalates from there.
It's like a ping pong, but with tariffs.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so Europe. We seem to be in a tricky spot here, right? Kind of caught between these two titans.
Yeah, they're walking a tightrope, that's for sure. They have their own issues with China's trade practices, but they're also a bit wary of the U.S.'s approach.
Right.
So it's like they're trying to balance their economic ties with China while also keeping their alliance with the U.S. strong. Tricky situation.
Okay, let's zoom in on those U.S. policies under Trump for a minute. America first, that was the big slogan.
Yeah.
What did that actually look like in terms of trade?
So America First was all about protecting American jobs and industries, right? And their main tool for that was, well, tariffs, obviously. But also, they wanted to renegotiate existing trade deals, the ones they thought weren't fair to the U.S.
Okay.
And the idea was basically to shrink the U.S. trade deficit. That's when you import way more than you export.
Right. So those tariffs on China, they weren't small potatoes, right?
Yeah. Oh, no, they were huge. We're talking like $250 billion worth of goods just from China getting hit with these tariffs. And it wasn't just like one specific thing. It was everything from steel and aluminum, which, goes into tons of stuff,
Sure.
to like high-tech components and electronics. And of course, China fired back, especially targeting American farmers. Those soybean tariffs really hurt.
Yeah, those were big news. So the U.S. goal was to like boost American manufacturing, right? Bring jobs back. But how did that actually play out?
Well, it's a mixed bag, to be honest. Sure, some manufacturing did come back, but it wasn't this huge boom. And in the meantime, prices for a lot of stuff went up for American consumers.
Like what kind of stuff?
Oh, everyday things. Washing machines, electronics, even some clothes. Those tariffs got passed on to the shoppers.
Oh, okay.
And businesses that relied on Chinese imports, their costs went up too, which made them less competitive. So it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
And what about China? How'd they handle all this?
Well, their economy definitely took a hit. Growth slowed down, and their exports to the U.S. dropped. But they're pretty adaptable. They started investing more in their own industries, trying to become more self-sufficient.
Makes sense.
And they started looking for new trading partners, too.
Yeah.
Diversifying, not putting all their eggs in the American basket anymore.
So spreading the risk.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that Canada and Europe got caught in the crossfire a bit. What happened there?
Well, the U.S., they put tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada, too. And Canada, obviously, didn't like that.
I bet.
Yeah, they hit back with tariffs on some pretty iconic American products, whiskey, dairy, that kind of thing.
Ooh, hitting them where it hurts, huh?
Yeah, kind of a symbolic retaliation. And then with Europe, same thing, tariffs on steel and aluminum, and Europe responded with tariffs on, motorcycles and bourbon came to mind.
Oh, okay, so targeting those American
Yeah,
brands.
making a statement.
Yeah.
And this all showed how, even America's allies weren't immune to these trade disputes.
Right. And then there was that whole thing with NAFTA, right? It got replaced by the USMCA.
Yeah.
What was the big deal with that?
Well, the USMCA did update some things like rules of origin and labor provisions, but the whole process was pretty messy, a lot of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely strained relations with Canada and Mexico, which are, huge trading partners for the U.S.
Right. So a lot of tension there. It seems like those Trump-era trade policies really, shook things up globally.
Oh, for sure. It was a turning point. And, there were people on both sides. Supporters said it was about time America stood up for itself, protected its workers.
Mm-hmm.
But critics, they worried about disrupting the global trade system, starting these trade wars, and hurting American consumers with higher prices.
So a lot of debate.
Yeah.
And really, that's the backdrop for everything we're seeing now. Right?
Yeah. Set the stage.
Okay, so we've talked about the history. Now, what are the big issues right now? What's still driving all this tension between the U.S., China, and Europe?
Well, first off, those tariffs, they're still there, right? We've got U.S. tariffs on tons of Chinese goods, everything from steel to electronics, and China's still hitting back, especially on American agriculture.
Right.
And then there's the tariffs on European steel and aluminum, which that's still causing friction with Europe.
Okay, so those are still live issues.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And then technology is a huge battleground right now, especially semiconductors. Those are like the brains of all our gadgets,
Yeah.
phones, computers, everything.
Right.
And the U.S. is really trying to limit China's access to the most advanced chips and the equipment you need to make them. They want to slow down China's tech industry.
Okay.
And China's response, they're pouring a ton of money into developing their own chip industry because they know how important it is. It's a tech race, basically.
Like a 21st century arms race, but with chips.
Exactly.
And intellectual property, that keeps coming up too. Why is that such a big deal in all this?
Yeah.
Well, the U.S. has been saying for years that China steals intellectual property, copying designs, stealing trade secrets, that kind of thing. And they say China forces companies to hand over their tech if they want to do business there. So that's led to all these tighter regulations and even bans on some Chinese tech companies in the U.S. You remember the whole Huawei and TikTok thing?
Yeah. So a lot of mistrust there.
A lot. And then, all this trade tension, it's forcing companies to rethink their whole global supply chain.
Oh, yeah, that's been huge.
Yeah. Companies used to rely on China for everything, manufacturing, sourcing materials, the whole works. But now with all these tariffs and the risk of things getting disrupted, they're diversifying.
Makes sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. They're looking at Vietnam, India, Mexico, places like that. They want to make their supply chains more resilient, less vulnerable to these trade wars.
So a lot of companies are basically having to remap their entire global operations.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking.
But it seems like under all this, there's this bigger game being played, right? It's not just about trade, it's about power.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's be real. This trade war is part of a much bigger power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. sees China's economic and technological rise as a threat, to their global dominance. And Europe, they're trying to figure out how to balance their economic ties with China and their alliance with the U.S. It's complicated.
For sure. So all these things we've been talking about, tariffs, tech battles, these shifting alliances, what's it all doing to the global economy? What's the real world impact here?
Well, one thing's for sure, prices are going up. Those tariffs, they act like a tax, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that gets passed on to consumers and businesses. We talked about those American farmers hit by China's tariffs. And here in the U.S., we're paying more for electronics, clothes, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's the supply chain chaos. It's causing delays, shortages, and just generally making things more expensive to move around. And then the pandemic hit, and that just threw everything into even more turmoil.
Yeah, it exposed how fragile those global supply chains really are.
Big time. And all this uncertainty, it's not good for the economy globally. Businesses are hesitant to invest, things slow down. It's like a chilling effect on growth.
Right.
And on top of that, you've got countries scrambling to make new trade deals, trying to reduce their reliance on the US or China.
Oh, right.
Like the EU is making deals with Japan and Canada, and China's strengthening ties with Africa and Southeast Asia. It's like everyone's hedging their bets, trying to find new partners.
So it's like a reshuffling of the global deck.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's this push for like countries to become more self-sufficient.
Yeah.
Especially in tech.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. Both the U.S. and China are pouring money into research and development. They want to be less dependent on each other, especially for things like semiconductors and AI.
Right.
And, in the long run, that could lead to a more fragmented world,
Yeah.
right? Like separate tech ecosystems, different trade blocks.
Like a splitting of the global economy.
Yeah, kind of. It's a big concern.
Okay, let's talk about Europe again. They're in a tough spot. What's their strategy in all this?
Well, Europe, they see the same problems with China's trade practices that the U.S. does, right? Like market access, intellectual property, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't want to completely cut ties with China. I mean, they do a ton of business together.
Right.
So they're trying to be careful. They're restricting some Chinese investment in Europe, for strategic reasons, but they're also trying to keep those trade channels open.
It's a balancing act for
They're
sure.
big time. And then with the U.S., well, they've had their own trade spats, right? Like
Yep.
those tariffs on steel and aluminum. But they also know they need to cooperate with the U.S., especially when it comes to China.
Makes sense. Yeah, they've got that Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, where they're trying to work together on things like tech standards and supply chain security. So it's a complicated relationship with both competition and cooperation.
So it sounds like Europe trying to carve out its own path, right? Not fully siding with either the U.S. or China.
Exactly. They call it strategic autonomy. They want to be more self-reliant, less dependent on anyone else. So they're investing in their own tech industry, strengthening trade ties with other regions. It's about having more options, more flexibility.
So looking ahead, where do we go from here? What are the possibilities, the potential scenarios?
Well, one possibility is that things get even worse. More tariffs, more bans, more decoupling between the U.S. and China. That could be really bad for the global economy.
Right.
But, there's always a chance they could work things out, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a new trade deal. Although, honestly, that doesn't seem likely right now. They'd have to overcome some pretty big differences. And then, the rest of the world, they're going to keep adapting. We'll probably see more new trade blocs forming, like that CPTPP.
Right. Countries banding together.
Yeah. And the tech rivalry, that's going to keep heating up. But the U.S. and China are going to keep pouring money into AI, semiconductors, all that. And Europe's going to try to keep up.
It's a whole new kind of global competition.
It is. And it could lead to a much more divided world economically, separate systems, different spheres of influence. It's a big question mark right now, how it's all going to play out.
Well, this has been a real deep dive.
Right.
To say the least. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. But I think the key takeaway is that this trade situation between the U.S., China, and Europe, it's not just some like abstract economic thing. It's a huge conflict with real-world consequences for everyone.
Absolutely. It affects everything, from the prices we pay to the technology we use to the relationships between countries. It's all connected.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's this web of trade, technology, and geopolitics, and they're all tangled up together. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question. We've talked about all these different factors, the tariffs, the tech race, the alliances. Out of all that, what do you think will be the single biggest factor in shaping how this all plays out? And what might be a totally unexpected consequence of that factor? Something to think about.
Yeah, something to ponder. It's a fascinating and, frankly, pretty crucial question.
It is. All right. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.